So, what if you took all the disasters and turned them up to 11? Could you make a loser into a winner? At different points in Civ 7's one-year history, various leaders in Civs have been singled out as not quite making the cut. This is inevitable as the devs work behind the scenes to create balance, even as they add new content and have to then rebalance the game as a whole all over again. I remember early on Tecumseh being given short shrift by some people because his game was based on the shaky stilts of city-states that could be knocked out from under him by other players. And he relied too much on food when production was more highly valued. Because I like underdogs, I tried him out even before the food rebalancing and found that he worked pretty well. And boy, if you put him with Greece and their little bit of influence, he became quite the powerhouse early on. The way I finished my game with him was with Siam, a civ that wasn't getting much positive attention, if any attention at all back then. But what was clear was that there was quite the influence game lurking under the surface, and Siam was the ultimate game closer in that regard. For a while, Egypt and Hatshepsut were considered unremarkable, but are definitely in full desert renaissance these days. Pachacuti was undervalued because of his reliance on mountains. Chola was given meh ratings until the water update, and the Kalam graduated from standalone star to linchpin for exploration victory. After its nerfing, Hawaii was undervalued, and I decided to play it on an archipelago map that took advantage of all its coastal bonuses. It was still pretty decent, even before the water update. While I haven't personally championed all these stray puppies, I did try to rescue some of them in private. Napoleon Revolutionary was probably my most public attempt, and I don't think I convinced too many people, at least before he was buffed with some extra culture and a packed commander. I've been chipping away at his doppelganger, Napoleon Emperor, in private, and will hopefully have something on him in the future. But the Khmer just never blew me away. I tried a few times, sighed, shrugged, and moved on. But recently, I had an idea that might give them a nudge. And a little background here. Despite my positive take on Civ 7, I want to correct any perception that I'm a positive person. I'm a very negative person because I've found that approach to be really useful. This contrasts with some people who can look at a disaster and see an opportunity. And I don't just mean the crisis capitalists who swoop in during disasters to gouge victims and governments. I mean people who really see a problem as an opportunity. My poet mind, though, is always looking for ways to bring unlike things together. So what if we could marry the negative and the positive ways of looking at things? What if the world just got worse and worse, and we realized we could use that? What does this have to do with the Khmer? Well, their Baray gives them immunity to flood damage in that settlement. So if you just followed their game plan and settled on floodplains consistently and built your Barays as soon as possible, you could just get increased yields of food, production, science all over the place. Get a leader who could make something of that, and you could accomplish something great maybe. Now, people have thought this already, but the problem is that if you keep the default disaster setting in the custom settings at light, you just might not get enough yields to make it worthwhile. But dialing the disaster severity and frequency up to 11 would be irresponsible, right? So the only question was who to pick as leader. I tried Isabella first because I thought it would be cool to get extra yields on her wonders. But it turns out her wonder bias trumps the floodplain bias of the Khmer. and that kind of defeated the purpose of what I was trying to do, although it was still a pretty decent game. Tecumseh was a thought, as was Pachacuti, but ultimately I went with Confucius in case I got a good tall game going with the Khmer, and then I could leverage his specialist powers even in antiquity. But it could have easily been one of the other two guys, honestly. As with the Isabella game, I projected the best two paths as economic and scientific, because, well, that was how the previous game worked out. I picked Quali as my first memento because I figured I'd be stacking all my resources in two cities, and that's where you get your gold for Quali, and earning a little extra gold that might help cover the damage I was going to do to the place with all the disasters. And then I wanted to finally try Green Colonel's Jacket. I haven't used that before, which gives you a nice hit of gold for every trade route you have going. And it's doubled if you have the most trade routes. Okay, I can do that. Part 1 of the Memento plan went as planned. Lots of resources and cities. Part 2 did not. And I'll get to that. But look, keep in mind, this is a lot like I do other things in this channel. It's an experiment, not a proven way to get a win. I'm just throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. And it just happens that blood sticks really well. There, that's your foreshadowing. I was 3 settlements deep and 36 turns in when Ashoka, world conqueror, decided he didn't like the cut of my jib and declared on me, even though I had been working on my jib all winter. I had really wanted to get that 4th settlement up and running first, but maybe the Khmer were meant to not get too wide. Still, I did get the 4th settlement up and running during that war, but unfortunately, Ashoka managed to take my 3rd settlement, Famai. What he didn't know was that in my scouts' travels, I'd come across the independent power Levanta, camped under a brooding Mount Everest. And I befriended them out of the goodness of my heart, obviously, only to finally absorb them into my network just after I lost Famai. So I was okay with my consolation prize, and back to 4 settlements. But the peace didn't last long. Ashoka was on the offensive again, like 10 turns later, something like that. And after a lot of back and forth, I held out, and he grudgingly offered up Famai, which I took, while saying something like, "And a good day to you, sir." While all this had been going on, I had picked up an alliance with Ibn Battuta, who also hated Ashoka. I figured at least he wasn't at war with anyone, which is my current low standard for an alliance, by the way. Meanwhile, I hadn't quite gotten my trade routes going to take advantage of, I keep wanting to call it Colonel Green's Jacket, as if he was some character in a board game or an Agatha Christie novel. But any second now, except the very next turn after Ashoka surrendered, Lafayette and Friedrich, Baroque, wanted to know how loyal I was to Ibn, and when I stuck by him, they declared on me. 3 wars in a row is hard. That's a given. But having 3 out of 4 leaders at war with you really cuts into your trade possibilities. I know, boo-hoo, your first world problems. It wasn't a huge amount of gold not to be getting, but I just had wanted to know how it would work out. That's not asking too much. By this point, I'd converted my 2nd settlement to a city and now had 2 production powerhouses to turn towards the war effort. So it could have gone much worse. Even so, at one point my capital was inches away from collapsing earlier to one of Ashoka's bold moves, and while I was fending off Lafayette to the east, Friedrich managed to sneak up on Levanta. Now, to be fair, if I had actually put a unit in there, there would have been no sneaking. Totally my oversight. Sorry, Levanta. When the two buddies came looking for peace a little while later, I managed to wrangle a southern tundra coastal town, Rosicade, from Lafayette. But when I tried to get Levanta back from Friedrich, well, he was unimpressed, and we stayed at war for an extra, 26 turns. It ended, though, when I took Lalibela from Friedrich, and he finally caved. And just when that war was dragging on, I began to wonder, wasn't it about time for another war with Ashoka? And true to his sense of timing, he declared just before Lafayette sued for peace. We fought for a long while before I finally got him to cave, and I wrestled Takasila right on my border away from him. So it was a tidy end to a long, messy age overall. With all of that going on, did I manage to increase my yields with my berets? Well, partly yes, partly no. It was easier in the cities, but I couldn't afford to pay for them, as little as they were, in my towns when I was constantly having to spend gold on units. Never mind that sometimes I just plain forgot about them in the confusion. And for the longest time, I only had one commander and was streaking across the map from threatened settlement to threatened settlement. Couldn't afford to buy another of those either. Getting 8 settlements was not what I had planned for my tall civ build, but there you go. I didn't complete the science legacy path, but I finished the economics somehow when I finally got some roots online near the end of the game. Overall, was the disaster experiment an unintentional strategic disaster? In the sense of not the best results, yes. In the sense of passable results in the face of an age of almost uninterrupted wars, not too bad, really, overall. And in terms of yields to my settlements, there were noticeable upticks as a result of river and volcanic activity happening more often. Of course, I wasn't insured for volcanoes, so that sucked a little more whenever that happened. But I like what I've seen in this run, and I think I might try something like this again. In fact, I have my next 2 steps picked already, and maybe you'll see those on the channel eventually. And how do I feel about the Khmer? They are like any civ in the game. If you give them room to do what they do best, they're still good as a whole. I don't think that this particular run would convince people of their indispensability, but I'm convinced they're at least a little better than I remembered. And elephants. You can't hit rock bottom when you have elephants. Anyway, that's it for me for now. If you liked what you saw or you heard, then please drop a like or a subscribe down below. This is Civilized Raccoon, and I'll see you next time.
All manner flooded Khmer markets, bringing abundance as steady as a summer's rain.